Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. For months, President Trump has been telling the world that Iran is the one running out of options. But now, there is a very different question being asked in Washington. What if Trump is the one running out of options? A recent Wall Street Journal analysis raised exactly that question, arguing that after more than 5 months of war, Iran appears to be holding more leverage than anyone expected. That sounds strange. The United States has overwhelming military power. It has sanctions. It controls the dollar-based financial system. It has allies throughout the Gulf. And if Trump really wanted to escalate the war, the United States still has the ability to hit Iran extremely hard. So how could Iran possibly have the stronger hand? The answer comes down to one place: the Strait of Hormuz. And more importantly, it comes down to something much bigger than the strait itself. It comes down to the price of oil, inflation, and American politics. According to recent reporting, Trump has been signaling a more cautious approach toward Iran. Instead of immediately launching another major military operation, the administration appears increasingly interested in economic pressure and maintaining the maritime blockade. Trump has pointed to Iran's inflation, financial shortages, and worsening economic conditions as evidence that the pressure campaign is working. In other words, Washington's message is becoming: we don't necessarily have to bomb Iran again. We can make Iran's economy hurt until Tehran decides it has had enough. At the same time, negotiations over reopening the Strait of Hormuz are continuing. But Iran is not simply asking for the strait to be reopened. Tehran is reportedly attaching conditions. Iran wants sanctions relief. It wants the blockade lifted. It wants compensation for losses. And it argues that as long as Tehran considers hostile actions continue, it cannot guarantee the security of the waterway. That is an extraordinary negotiating position. Because the longer the strait remains effectively closed or threatened, the greater the pressure on global energy markets. Oil prices rise. Shipping costs rise. Insurance costs rise. And eventually, those costs can reach American consumers. That is where the Iranian strategy becomes much more interesting. Iran does not need to defeat the United States militarily. It doesn't need to destroy the American Navy. It doesn't even need to completely shut down global oil supplies. It simply needs to create enough uncertainty around one of the world's most important energy choke points to keep oil prices elevated. And that can create a problem for Donald Trump that has nothing to do with the battlefield. It creates a political problem. Think about the logic. If the Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted, global energy prices remain under pressure. Higher energy prices feed into inflation. Higher inflation hurts American consumers. And higher inflation becomes especially dangerous for a president approaching the midterm elections. This is why the Strait of Hormuz may be Iran's most important bargaining chip. But here is where the story gets even more interesting. Because Trump appears to be using almost exactly the same weapon against Iran. Trump's strategy is essentially: if you want to use energy and inflation to pressure America, then we will use economic pressure and inflation to pressure you. The United States can maintain a blockade. That can restrict Iran's ability to export oil. It can reduce government revenue. It can worsen shortages. And it can increase economic pressure inside Iran. So suddenly, this is no longer simply a military confrontation. It becomes a contest over who can tolerate economic pain longer. And that is a very different kind of war. Iran's advantage is that it can impose relatively cheap costs on a much larger economy. A drone, a missile, a mine, or even the credible threat of an attack can force commercial ships to reconsider whether they want to travel through the strait. The cost of creating the threat can be relatively small. The economic consequences can be enormous. That is the essence of asymmetric warfare. The United States may spend millions of dollars protecting a shipping lane, while Iran may only need a relatively inexpensive weapon to create another security crisis. But we should be careful here, because saying Iran has leverage is not the same thing as saying Iran is winning. And this is where I think the phrase "Trump has no cards" goes too far. Trump absolutely still has cards. The problem is that every card comes with a price. The first and most obvious American card is military power. The United States can still strike Iran. It can destroy military infrastructure. It can hit missile sites. It can attack command centers. It can impose enormous costs on the Iranian military. That option has not disappeared, but using it could create another problem. If another major American attack leads Iran to retaliate against shipping, energy infrastructure, or American interests in the region, oil prices could rise even further. So Washington could win a military battle and still create an economic problem at home. That's the dilemma. The second American card is the blockade itself. The blockade is not as dramatic as airstrikes, but it may be strategically important. Every day that Iran's oil exports and access to international markets are restricted puts additional pressure on Tehran's finances. Iran may be able to endure pressure for a long time, but endurance is not the same thing as economic strength. A government can survive enormous economic pain without being in a strong position. The third American card is sanctions and the dollar. Washington has enormous influence over Iran's access to the international financial system. Trump can tighten sanctions. He can loosen them. He can offer partial sanctions relief as part of a deal. Or he can threaten even more severe financial pressure. That gives the United States something very important in negotiations: flexibility. And then there is the fourth American card: diplomacy. The United States still has relationships with many Arab states in the Gulf. It still has a much larger diplomatic network, and it can coordinate pressure on Iran in ways Tehran cannot easily replicate. So no, Trump is not out of cards. But there is an important distinction between having a card and having a good card. Some of Trump's cards are extremely expensive to play, and that may be what the Wall Street Journal is really getting at. The question isn't whether the United States can hurt Iran. Of course it can. The question is whether the United States can hurt Iran without hurting itself. That is much harder. And this is where Iran's strategy becomes politically interesting. Iran understands that Trump has a clock. The midterm elections are approaching. The administration has strong incentives to keep inflation under control. American voters may support military action under certain circumstances, but they are much less enthusiastic about paying significantly more for gasoline and everyday goods. Iran doesn't need to control American politics. It simply needs to understand American political vulnerabilities. And one of those vulnerabilities is the price at the gas pump. This doesn't mean Iran can simply wait forever. That's another important limitation. Iran is suffering from the same economic conflict it is trying to impose on America. Its economy is under enormous pressure. Its government needs revenue. Its oil exports matter. Its population has to live with inflation and shortages. And keeping the strait closed or restricted also damages Iran's own interests. So this is not a situation where Iran can simply sit back and watch America collapse. It can't. Iran also has a clock. And that means the real strategic question may be, who feels the pain first? That is a much more interesting question than who has more weapons. Because America clearly has more military power. Iran clearly has geographic leverage. America has the dollar. Iran has the Strait of Hormuz. America has allies. Iran has asymmetric warfare. America has economic power. Iran has the ability to disrupt energy markets. And both sides have something they desperately want to protect. For Trump, it is economic stability and political credibility. For Iran's leadership, it is regime survival and the ability to negotiate without appearing to surrender. This is why a quick, clean victory is becoming increasingly difficult. If Trump wants to completely eliminate the Iranian threat, he may have to pay a very high price. If he wants to avoid that price, he may have to accept a compromise. And Iran knows that. This is also why the current negotiations matter so much. If a deal eventually reopens the strait, it will not necessarily mean Iran won. And if Trump maintains the blockade, it will not necessarily mean America won. The real measure of success will be what each side has to give up. Can Trump get the strait reopened without giving Iran major concessions? Can Iran get sanctions relief without surrendering its strategic leverage? Can Washington keep oil prices under control? Can Tehran survive the economic pressure? And perhaps most importantly, can both sides find an off-ramp before the economic consequences become worse than the political benefits of continuing the confrontation? That is the real game. And there is one more reason this matters for Americans. The conflict is no longer just about Iran. It is increasingly about the American economy. Oil prices affect transportation. Transportation affects food and manufactured goods. Energy prices affect inflation. Inflation affects interest rates. Interest rates affect housing, borrowing, investment, and consumer spending. And all of that eventually reaches the ballot box. So when we talk about the Strait of Hormuz, we are not talking about some distant body of water that only matters to oil traders. We are talking about a potential pressure point connecting a war in the Middle East directly to the daily lives of American voters. That is precisely why Iran's leverage is real. But it is also why Iran's leverage has limits. The United States has enormous resources and enormous staying power. Iran has geographic leverage, but it does not have unlimited economic endurance. Trump has military power, but he does not have unlimited political patience. And that leaves us with a much more complicated picture than Trump has no cards. The better description is this: Trump has plenty of cards. He just doesn't have a cheap card. Every military option risks higher oil prices. Every economic option takes time. Every diplomatic concession risks looking weak. And every additional month of uncertainty creates political and economic costs. Iran faces a similar dilemma from the opposite direction. It has a powerful bargaining chip in the Strait of Hormuz, but the longer it uses that chip, the more economic damage it risks causing to itself. So the winner may not be the side with the most cards. The winner may be the side that can tolerate the cost of playing its cards longer. And that is why the next stage of the US-Iran confrontation may be less about who can launch the biggest attack and more about who can withstand the pressure. For Trump, the temptation will be to prove that America still has overwhelming power. For Iran, the temptation will be to prove that America's power has limits. And the Strait of Hormuz sits right in the middle of that contest. So the question for Washington is not simply, can America defeat Iran? The United States almost certainly has the military capability to inflict enormous damage on Iran. The harder question is, can America force Iran to surrender its leverage without triggering an even bigger economic and political crisis at home? That is the real challenge facing Trump. And if he cannot find an answer to that question, then the problem isn't that he has no cards. The problem is that every card he holds comes with a price. Thanks for watching.